On November 21, 1971, a family of 6. Keith 40 for Joni 41, Ryan 17, Mike 15 and twins Jake and Jan age 13 were traveling along Interstate on Nevada between Elko and Battle Mountain when they ran into a horrible storm. What happened in the desert that night was absolutely terrifying. What was found the next day by 2M workers was mysterious and disturbing. Jake told his story a decade later in an interview with a journalist. There's a killer on the road. His brain is squirming like a toad. I'll never forget Jim Morrison's voice as that song played on the radio as we drove along that empty desert highway. We left Salt Lake City about 3:00 p.m. on our way to Reno to visit our cousins for Thanksgiving. We planned on staying at a hotel somewhere along the way. I remember my father saying, "Hey guys, we're entering Nevada, nothing out here but sagebrush." He was right. As I looked out the window, that was pretty much what I saw. We still had about a 6-hour drive, and I could see it wouldn't be long before it was dark. I quickly fell asleep after that, and the next thing I remember was hearing my mother say, "Keith, the rain is really coming down. Are we going to be okay?" "Yeah, we'll be fine. I may have to slow down a bit, but this isn't the first time I've driven in a storm like this," he responded. As I looked out the windshield from the back seat, I could see the rain. Welcome to Dark Road Legends. Where fear takes form and shadows tell their stories. Let's begin. Was in fact pouring down, even with my father having the windshield wipers on max. It was still hard to see. That made me nervous. He drove for probably another 20 minutes before he said, "This is getting bad. I'm going to stop for a while to see if it calms down. The next hotel we see, we'll stop for the day." He then drove to the next highway exit and got off. If you've ever been on the highway in the desert, you'll know there are random exits that lead to dirt. Are old mines everywhere, some dating back 100 years or more. As my father pulled over and parked the car, he said, "We'll stay here for a bit. I'm going to take a nap and hopefully the storm has passed by then." There was silence in the car as we all fell asleep. The next thing I remember as I was jolted awake was my father trying to start the car, but it wouldn't. "What's wrong, Keith?" asked my mother. "Not sure. It won't turn over at all. It's like the battery is completely dead," he replied. He then popped the hood and went to have a look. By this time the storm had mostly subsided and appeared to be just sprinkling. A few minutes later he came back inside and said, "I can't tell what's wrong. No wires have come off that I can see." "Well, what do we do?" asked my mother. "We can't just sit here all night and hope someone happens to find us. I can walk back up the hill to the highway and see if I can flag someone down." As I walk down the road towards the next town, I'm not sure how far away that is, but hope it's not too far, he responded. "Are you sure that's a good idea?" asked my mother. "What other choice do we have? It's starting to get cold in here and we'll only get colder. Keep the doors locked and I'll be back as soon as I can, which may be sooner than you think," replied my father, letting out a slight chuckle as he got out of the car, closing the door behind him. The rest of my siblings slept as my mother and I sat there anxiously waiting for him to return. The windows inside the car had fogged up and it was starting to get really cold when suddenly something slammed up against the side of the car. Something then hit the window I was sitting next to and someone screamed, "Don't get out of the car. Whatever you do, stay in the car." It sounded like my father. I then heard him yelling some more and sounds of struggling and fighting. Then it immediately stopped. Keith, is that you? What's wrong?" screamed my mother. I started crying and hysterically yelled out, Dad, my siblings had woken up by now. We are also panicking, asking what's going on. My mother quickly climbed into the back seat of the car with us. As we sat there huddled together, not knowing what was going to happen next, one of my siblings who had been asleep asked, "What's going on? Where's Dad?" "I don't know. The car won't start." So he went for help, and I think that was him hitting the car and yelling just now. My mother replied right as she finished saying that something must have grabbed the passenger side car door and ripped it Off because it went flying through the air, landing a ways from the car. Everyone get out now, run up the hill towards the highway, shouted my mother. We quickly scrambled out of the car and ran towards the hill that led up to the highway. As we ran up the hill, I was in the lead and heard what sounded like Ryan yelling out for help from the bottom of the hill. His cries were cut off as quickly as they started. Part of me was saying, turn around and go help him, but another part of me said to keep running. Once I made it to the highway, I turned around to see who else was behind me. It was dark and hard to see due to the clouds, but Jan wasn't too far behind me. I thought I could faintly make out someone else behind Jan. As he got closer, I could see it was Mike. Where is everyone else? Asked Mike as he tried catching his breath. I'm not sure they weren't behind you, I replied. No, not that I could tell, he responded. What do we do now? I asked. I don't know, but we need to get help. Keep an eye out for the next car that drives by. What happened exactly? Where the hell is Dad? Asked Mike. The car wouldn't start, so he went to get help. A little while later, something slammed into the car and I could hear Dad shouting at us to stay in the car. It sounded like he was fighting with something, then it just stopped. A few minutes later, something had ripped the car door off, then we took off running. I replied, we need to find Mom and Ryan, but I don't want to go back down there, said Mike. Me either, I'm sure it was Ryan. I heard screaming from the bottom of the hill. I said, let's start walking down the highway and pray a car comes along soon, said Mike. I nodded my head and started following him. There was still a light rain coming down and my clothes were wet. I wasn't shivering yet because I'd been running, but I could feel the cold starting to set in. We walked for a while with no cars driving by on either side of the highway, when Mike suddenly stopped dead in his tracks. He stood there looking dazed for a bit, not saying anything. Mike, are you all right? I asked. He said nothing, so I put my hand on his shoulder, shook him, and asked again, Mike, you all right? We need to get off the road, find somewhere to stay for the night. He finally said, why, what are you talking about? We just need a car to come by, I said without looking at me or saying anything. He turned and started walking off the highway, heading out into the desert. Jan looked at me and asked, Jake, what do we do? I don't want to be out here alone. In my mind, I knew we should stay on the road and continue walking, but I was torn between following Mike and what I knew I should do. Fine, let's follow Mike. I don't know what he's doing, but I sure hope he does, I replied. We stumbled along as we followed him, walking along the soft wet dirt that covered the desert floor. As he walked, he never turned around or said anything. It was like he was in some sort of a trance. He was also moving fairly fast. It was hard for me and Jan to keep up sometimes, moving along like we were seemed to keep us warm though, which was a good thing. Luckily the rain had stopped and the clouds were starting to clear, making way for the stars to come out, which made it easier to see in the dark. I'd guessed we walked for several miles when we came to the top of a small hill that overlooked a valley. Now that the sky was clear, I was able to see not too far away what looked like some old houses. There were no lights on and no roads from what I could see, so I assumed the houses were old and abandoned. Mike seemed to hesitate for a split second at the top of the hill, then continued his translate state, walking towards the houses. Mike, wait, why are you going there? I asked. I got no response from him as he got further and further away from me and Jan. Come on, Jan, we need to keep up, I said. Jan didn't say anything, just nodded her head. She had her arms wrapped around herself and I could see she was cold and tired in that moment, though I remember being grateful we still had our shoes on when we jumped out of the car. As we continued walking towards the houses, following Mike, I could see he was almost there when I got within a stone throw away from the first house. I caught some sudden movement out of the corner of my eye. This made me immediately stop and Jan, who was behind me, walked into the back of me saying, hey, why'd you stop? I saw something moving over there. As I pointed to the left of the first house. What did you see? She asked in a fearful tone. I'm not sure, but it wasn't Mike, I replied. I then started looking around from Mike and could see he was nowhere in sight, and immense shot of fear surged through me like I'd just been hit with a baseball bat. Mike, where are you? I said aloud. But not too loud. Seconds went by with no response. Jake, I'm scared, said Jan. I know. Me too, I replied as my feet remained frozen to the desert floor. I was about to call out to Mike again when I saw something dark about the size of a man, but it was not built like a man, 50 yards in front of us, running from one house to the one next to it. I almost screamed out as I stumbled back into Jan. Did you see that? I asked Jan in a trembling voice. See what you're scaring Emmy, Jake replied. Jan, something big ran from that house to that one over there, I said as I pointed to the area I saw the thing running. We said nothing as we stood there scared to death, deciding what to do next, when we heard Mike let out the most horrific scream I've never in all my life heard him scream like that, and it's something I shall never forget. We then heard thrashing noise coming from inside the house. The dark thing ran towards Jan, started crying, grabbed my arm and squeezed tightly, saying, Jake, was that Mike? I'm so scared. My mind was telling me to run, but my body would not obey me without warning. The thrashing noise stopped. That's when I was able to make my body move as I whispered loudly to Jan, we need to run, we need to get out of here. Now where do we go? She asked. Turn around and go back the way we came. We need to hurry, I replied. Jan wouldn't move as I started backing away, so I grabbed her by the arm and started pulling her along with me. After a bit she came to and turned around with me as we started walking away from the houses as fast as we could. Our walking quickly turned to running as we ran through the tall sage brush. I kept looking over my shoulder, checking to see if the dark thing was following us. Once we made it to the other side of the hill we'd been before, we stopped as we needed to catch our breath. I looked at Jan as she looked at me, crying. I was unable to cry even though I wanted to. I was in some kind of shock because everything that had happened to me over the last few hours seemed surreal. I was about to tell Jan we should keep moving when I caught movement on the skyline of the hill. I could see it on top of the hill, standing there looking down at us. The sagebrush we've been running through came up to almost my shoulders, and I was about 5'5" at the time, and this thing looked to be around the same height as me but was much wider looking. The shape of its head against the skyline also looked extremely odd. I thought whatever it is, it can't be a man. I grabbed Jan's arm and said, Jan, look up at that thing on the hill, we need to run now. She looked up and let out a small shriek as she saw it. Also, we quickly turned and started running again. I wasn't even sure in which direction. I was so scared my knees were wobbling, which made it hard to run, almost causing me to fall down multiple times. At this point I didn't even care to look to see if the thing was behind us or not. I just focused on running as I navigated my way through the tall safe age. I also made sure I could hear Jan behind me as I ran. Suddenly, without warning, I tripped over something and started tumbling down a deep dark hole. As I tumbled through the darkness, time seemed to slow down, and the thought, this is how I'm going to die, went through my mind as clear as day. When I finally stopped, I landed on my back and could see Jan was on her way down as well. A few seconds later she landed on top of me, which hurt like hell. She laid there not moving or saying anything. I assumed she was unconscious. As I looked up through the darkness, I could see the stars clearly in the sky. The hole we'd fallen in appeared to be square-shaped at the top. A few minutes went by when suddenly the dark thing that had been chasing us appeared at the top of the hole looking down at us. It was easy to make out its outline against the stars. I started shaking Jan, saying, wake up, Jan, wake up. It's right there looking down at us, get up. No matter how hard I shook her or yelled at her, she would not wake up. Her body was lifeless, like the doll she used to play with when she was younger. The dark thing just stood there, never moving an inch for what I guessed were hours. Once the sky started to change color, which meant sunrise was not too far off, the dark thing quickly turned and was just gone like it was never there. As I laid in that hole watching the night turn to day with Jan's lifeless body still on top of me. Being I couldn't move, I was finally able to shed tears as I held her because I knew Jan was dead. Her body was starting to get cold and rigor mortis, I said aloud to myself many times as I laid there. This is how I'm going to die. This is how I'm going to die. I wasn't exactly sure how long I'd been out when I was awakened to the sound of laughter and men talking. At first I thought maybe I'd hit my head too hard, but then I saw movement above me. I mustered what little strength I had left and said, help me, all of a sudden I saw a man's head appear over the hole and say, holy, get over here. Now another man appeared over the hole. They then talked to each other. Then one of them quickly took off to go get help. I assumed, hey, are you all right? Asked the remaining man. I need help, my sister is dead, I replied as tears streamed down my face. Don't worry, Max is gone to get help. You hang in there and don't move, we'll get you out, said the man, who I later found out was Brent Wiscombe. The sheriff's department arrived at the hole a few hours later and were able to rescue Jay and retrieve Jan's body. Jake suffered multiple broken bones and lacerations. Jan's body was sent to a coroner. To cause of death was listed as a broken neck caused by tumbling down into the hole. Mac and Brent, who worked for a mining company, had been tasked that very day to install a fence around the old min shaft to prevent this very thing from happening. A search party was organized for the other family members, but their bodies were never recovered. Only pieces of blooded, shredded clothing were found surrounding their car. They did find the old abandoned house as Jake described and found pieces of Mike's clothing there as well. After spending several days with the sheriff's department, Jake was sent to live with his uncle and cousins in Reno, and there he remained until his death. Whenever someone asked what he thought the dark thing was, Jake's response was always evil. For more scary horror stories, please subscribe. Thank you for joining Dark Rot Legends. Subscribe for more tales of